Jordan Peterson is a well-known critic of the neo-Marxism of the Frankfurt School, as well as the collectivism of Marxism and identity politics. He stresses ideological individualism and political liberalism as an avenue of affording to the individual rights and freedoms. But most importantly, he believes that individualism and liberalism are instrumental in warding off authoritarianism, which he holds as responsible for the collective deaths of millions in the 20th century, i.e. the Holodomor, the Soviet purges, as well as the Holocaust. It is rich, then, to consider that of all of the doctrines of neo-Marxism, one of the most salient was Theodore W. Adorno's belief, explicated in The Authoritarian Personality, that authoritarianism results from mental pathology and is itself pathological. In various places, Peterson has been an exponent of this very view. He believes in the style of Carl Jung that authoritarianism results from the dominance of society by the father archetype, in which the metamorphosis of the son fails to materialize, insofar as the father is supposed to materialize his archetype in love by virtue of his offspring. On the opposite side of the equation, he also sees the maternal aspect of empathy as having a dark, potentially genocidal side. In that sense, he argues that in-group preference, empathy for loved ones, can transform into hatred of the other. He uses the metaphor of a vicious mother bear protecting her cubs. We can see then that in either case, whether there is an overbearing and unloving paternal principle or an overprotective maternal principle, the root of authoritarianism, in Peterson's view, is mental pathology. For Peterson, individualist liberalism is supposed to provide a means of counterbalance between the two aspects. Mutual brotherly love for all of humanity as a raceless set of individuals is supposed to prevent the unbalanced maternal principle. Remembrance that the purpose of society is for the uplifting of the individual is supposed to prevent imbalance in the paternal principle. But we do, of course, have a problem which Peterson has elsewhere admitted, dedicating his career to solving. Mainly that young men are, in droves, turning toward authoritarian rightism as a defense against the worst excesses of leftism within liberal society. Liberal individualism and egalitarianism were supposed to prevent this, and yet it has been an ineffective cure. What options are there left for Peterson? The answer is therapy. Peterson famously exhorts his devotees to clean your room. He instructs them to reduce suffering in their own lives, to confront their challenges bravely, in other words, to slay the dragon, just as the mythological Tiamat is slain to allow the creation of the world. Confronting one's difficulties and overcoming them, or at least acknowledging them, is supposed to be the source of balance, peace, and creative potential. But most of all, it is meant to prevent young men from seeking refuge in the far right by way of alleviating their pre-existing mental pathology. Now, alleviating mental pathology is all well and good from a certain perspective, assuming we are ignoring Peterson's ideologically motivated thinking. But in this paradigm, there is a sinister danger lurking that he has all but ignored, namely the therapeutic state. Thomas Szasz, notable writer in the anti-psychiatry movement, believed that one of the most insidious disguises that totalitarianism can cloak itself in is that of the guardian of mental health. Quote, therapeutic interventions have two faces, Szasz wrote. One is to heal the sick, the other is to control the wicked. Yet the standard for wickedness is always subjective and variable, and so the psychiatrist inherited from the Inquisition the task of quarantining society's dangerous elements. It was not a coincidence that, even decades after the word psychiatrist entered English in 1890, practitioners were often called alienists, derived from the French aliéné, meaning both alienated and insane. First, Szasz wrote, it was God and the priest who kept the unruly in check. Then came the totalitarian leader and his apologists, along with Freud and the psychoanalysts. It's also worth noting here that the structure of liberal rule also contributes to the rise of totalitarianism in many ways. As I said in my video, Liberal Totalitarianism, basically the individualization of politics also individualizes power, which is a prerequisite for the exercise of total unchecked power over everyone. One may pause and retort that Peterson would certainly not endorse medical totalitarianism. However, a conversation he had on Joe Rogan with Brett Weinstein reveals that Peterson is basically operating on the post-war consensus, which is the moral protocol of never again. In other words, the Holocaust can never be allowed to happen again. He agrees with Weinstein that somewhere in the genome, there's a kind of Hitler switch that could be flipped. The implication of this startling knowledge is that this Hitler switch must be forever suppressed lest we witness another Holocaust. Though Peterson has not explicitly argued for a therapeutic state, the only way to ensure that a person's Hitler switch isn't flipped would be to medicalize and psychologize politics of the personality. Never again is like, as I pointed out in other articles and videos, an element of the totalitarian seed that exists latent in liberalism. Liberalism does not self-perpetuate when people are allowed democratic freedom, so the freedoms must be managed or eliminated in order to ensure intolerance can never rule. This is Karl Popper's paradox of intolerance. Behind Jordan Peterson's liberal mask is a seething suspicion that every Gentile is a latent Nazi who must be forever suppressed by the educational and medical system. We are stuck in an insane asylum called America, where white interests are treated as the Hitler switch and promptly invalidated by force, and white advocates are inevitably punished for their imbalances. We can see the actual truth of Peterson's views when we consider that recently he took part in authoring, alongside leftist groups, a paper on the rise of anti-Semitism through social media networking effects, similar to a 2018 study on hate networks that led to the mass deplatforming of right-wing content creators such as Stefan Molyneux. It's quite clear that he is in favor of using force and social pressure, which are authoritarian measures, to control society and repress dissent. In the same breath as he repeats old never again nostrums, he also opines for the necessity of freedom of speech. But what if freedom of speech actually ends up activating people's Hitler switch? What will Peterson think of it then? We already know what he'll think, considering the paper he authored where he gave Tacit approval to the idea of hate speech. His attempt to impose himself upon the political pipeline as a retardant against nascent right-wing thought, against white collectivism, ends up failing when people can freely point out how whites are systematically and routinely abused in their own countries. So the only possible outcome for never again and for liberal individualism is once again to limit people's freedom. The anti-authoritarian liberal sheds his mask. Behold Jordan Peterson, the medico-political totalitarian. Not once has Peterson stood up for quote-unquote Nazis or for white advocates. At every turn he has tried disowning them, dismissing them, or funneling them back into liberal individualist politics where their fires are burned out forever. When will someone tell him the secret that, if you are in favor of free speech, you are also in favor of the political legitimacy of quote-unquote Nazism? Leftists will be quick to remind all liberal free speech fence-sitters of this, and yet they have the audacity to deny it. Don't they realize that they are denying themselves? One of the fundamental issues with Jordan Peterson, and Adorno for that matter, is that he has an intensely personal conception of politics and ideology. While it's true that politics is fundamentally driven by people, there are nonetheless impersonal elements in politics that have nothing to do with the personality. Politics in the intellectual field is a game of impersonal principles, not merely a calculation of personal benefit. Or at least it should be, and that's how it is for the most prominent writers on the subject. Political philosophies such as libertarianism, Marxism, or monarchism are reasoned to from first principles, having nothing whatsoever to do with the personality or any effects the ideology might have on the personality if implemented. National Socialism is conceived as an antipode and reaction to communism, as well as a necessary foil to capitalism, not a therapeutic mechanism for the inadequacies of white Germans. Again, it has nothing to do with the personality. However, Peterson argues that, quote-unquote, people don't have ideas, rather, ideas have people, following a passage from Carl Jung. For Peterson, political ideologies are nebulae floating in the collective unconscious that seize control of people like demons. So in essence, he removes the agency of political actors and declares for once and for all that no one can possibly arrive at their political position through reason and evidence. Of course, he exempts himself from this possibility that his ideas might just be an infliction, a psychological infliction. But rather, Peterson holds that people are merely attracted to ideas according to their specific personality traits, as if by magnetism. I cannot understate how this undercuts and disrespects both the agency and intelligence of human beings, quote unquote individuals whose faculties Peterson is supposed to be valorizing. Hitler was a very rational man, something both Peterson and Weinstein have actually agreed on. And since Hitler was rational, his political views cannot be the sole result of pathology, if pathology played any role in it whatsoever. Reason is impersonal, and there's nothing in National Socialism that is irrational, save for some of Hitler's mysteriosophic ideas about the Aryan race. The basic idea of an ethnocentric nation state based on the Volk and its blood and soil comports well with what we know about human kinship dynamics, evolutionary fitness, and natural in-group preference. Its collectivism mirrors the actual collectivism we see in daily human behavior. People identify with groups all the time. Collectivism can be rationally deduced from human behavior, and hence it is not irrational to include it as part of a political philosophy. I almost wanted to burst out laughing when I heard Jordan Peterson standing in front of an audience claim, "I'm not here to speak to a group, but rather I'm speaking to individuals."
One is I don't ever speak to a group, I always speak to individuals.
It isn't the collectivists who are irrational, but rather Jordan Peterson. Hitlerism and its anti-Semitism was a reaction against what Hitler saw as the Jewish control of the Weimar Republic, which, regardless of what you think about that, the Republic was nonetheless definitely decadent and full of corruption. It was also a reaction against Bolshevism, which had partly been responsible for the political violence in the Weimar Republic. Hitler saw the overrepresentation of Jews among the Weimar financial elite and believed that this had been responsible for the economic chaos. To see in Hitlerism pathology is only to deceitfully pathologize pattern recognition and to expose your own biases against racism. And in fact, it is exactly this that the devotees of Peterson do. They insist that we follow race-blind meritocracy, despite the effects of race differences causing problems in cities, as well as inspiring leftist depression morality by producing inequality. What does Peterson have to say about what we should do to deal with this problem? Very little. He redoubles back on individualism, which itself is irrational because humans are not reducible to individuals given that they are persons with organic social bonds. An actually rational solution would involve treating races based on their tendencies and their different personalities, rather than treating them all as equal individuals. If not this, then at the very least, whites must be allowed a form of collective bargaining just like the other races. Is it irrational to group up to enhance your political power and to argue for your own interests? Surely not. White collectivism is rational and necessary. It's not irrational identity politics. But because of Never Again, Peterson is interested only to paint it as pathology. Again, Gentiles must forever be suppressed because Gentiles carry Hitler's crimes in their blood, and their Hitler switch could be activated at any moment. Is this why Peterson never brings up that inconvenient anti-Semitic work of his favorite author, Solzhenitsyn, 200 Years Together? Even more irrational is Peterson's insistence that authoritarianism is in some way necessarily dangerous or pathological. We have already established that Peterson himself, if we follow his therapeutic logic and his interest to the national conclusion, is necessarily an authoritarian. Deep down, everyone who has a vision for how men should be ruled is an authoritarian, especially the anarchists. Authoritarianism is nothing more than the application of force to the problem of conflict, and everyone can agree that force is the only way, in the end, to resolve irreconcilable conflicts, whether that is done through the state as a mediator or directly by warlords and an anarchy. The only real difference between people is the degree of authoritarianism they wish to be used in society. And at any rate, authoritarianism has no special relationship with genocide. Mass genocide is, generally speaking, a modern phenomenon enabled by the increase of populations, the concept of populations, as well as war technology and what Foucault calls governmentality. People have committed pogroms before without any authoritarian tendencies, namely the genocide of Neanderthals by Homo sapiens, which were carried out under tribal conditions in driven by the necessity of intergroup conflict over territory and resources. But nevertheless, the scale of pre-modern genocides was generally much lower. And in general, it was not driven by authoritarianism. And all of that could be said about authoritarianism, most of pre-modern history was authoritarian. And of course, as I've said, mass pogroms are very far and few between. In fact, the very government under which we live is authoritarian in many ways, especially in Europe and Australia. Authoritarianism is the norm, whether you like it or not, and singling out white collectivism as dangerous authoritarianism is unfair in the grand scheme of history, and it becomes obvious what game Peterson is trying to play. Get whites to accept their own dispossession by convincing them to be individuals rather than banding together to resist their oppressors. As Ryan Falk has said in his video, Jordan Peterson's Fancy Backswing, Peterson is demanding that white people who have been dispossessed and disenfranchised inside their own nations cease banding together as a collective for the sake of individualist principles. Peterson is just commanding whites to be chumps, commanding them to be losers. Thankfully, since his alternative medicine benzo detox has left him brain damaged, he isn't as much of an effective speaker now, if he ever was. And of course, this highlights the fact that Jordan Peterson himself was subject to very many mental pathologies. He's mostly still telling people to clean their rooms and delivering heretical lectures on the psychological meaning of the Bible. The damage he can cause to the right is at present almost nothing, but it is still fruitful to remember that liberal blowhards like Peterson are all hypocrites. They decently supported the leftist domination of society by posing the only real principled opposition to the left.